And I'm going to hand it over to Loretta now.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you everybody for joining our session tonight. It's lovely to see you. So we'll immediately start with our topic for today, which is teaching language through literature. And that's why you're here now, right? I hope you're all happy to hear about what we'll have to discuss for tonight. And we have invited our subject matter expert, our friend Alice Pivnicheru. Alice Pivnicheru holds a combined BA and BD in English language and literature, an MA in English with a focus on Canadian literature, and a TESL Canada Advanced Standard 2 certificate. She has been teaching ESL and EFL for over 30 years in Romania, the US, and Canada. She has experience teaching at the secondary level and currently teaches COM, ESL, and EAP courses at Mohawk College. In her classroom, students learn to use the various registers of the English language confidently as a tool for success rather than a barrier. She's a firm believer and practitioner of the principles of UDL because they empower students to be intrinsically motivated, thus making learning authentic, anchored in reality. Her teaching philosophy gravitates around the idea that true learning only happens when the process empowers students to understand and enjoy the connection between knowledge and life. Thank you so much, Alice, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Loretta.
It's a pleasure. Okay, great. So let's start with our first question for tonight. And the very first one is, what is the overall purpose of using literary text to teach language? So as everybody knows, we pose the question to our subject matter expert first, but then everybody is more than welcome to join in and share their own experience. So Alice, what is the purpose of using literary text to teach language?
Well, I would say teaching literature to reach language serves several purposes. So one of them, an important one, is to provide an option, a better option, I say, for the standard, often drill-based mechanical acquisition of language patterns and structures that we sometimes teach. It also serves the purpose of providing interesting context that is natural and relatable to the students. In order to supplement the everyday register of language, as well as the academic, professional, formal language register that they learn. It also encourages reading as a natural way of language acquisition, and I am very passionate about this. It also caters to the needs of English language learners that are literature and sometimes or history lovers. So it gets them into something that they are passionate about, and second language learning doesn't become just a chore. It also stimulates imagination. This is also very important. It stimulates imagination and possible analogic connections with language, their first language. And in this way, the second language learning becomes something that is more organic, like a lived experience. Like I said before, it gets out of being a chore. It's something that is also enjoyable as well as useful. So that's my point.
Thank you, Alice. Oh, sorry, Loretta, I cut you off. I was just going to say thank you so much, Alice. Now we're going to remind everyone in the chat that if you'd like to either type your response to this question, or if you'd like to raise your question or your response out loud, you can just use the raise hand button. Just a reminder, it's located at the bottom of your screen to the very right, and it says reactions. If you click on that reactions button, there's a raise hand button right above that. So please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to give a response, or you can also type your response in the chat. Nothing yet, but it's a really good question, I think, right? When we talk about literary text and teaching language, like I love what Alice mentioned, right? Many of our learners already have a love for literature, or maybe for history, or maybe for whatever topic they're interested in their own language, and they're passionate about reading about it. So transferring that skill over is a really great way to encourage that kind of learning when it comes to language. So thanks so much for that, Alice. Hi, everybody. Okay, I think we might be a little bit shy today, Loretta. Maybe we can move on to the next.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's really nice when students, especially when they see a story that they have read previously in their own language, they really love it. Like, oh, I know about this story, and they are eager to learn more and read it in English in our case. So that's so true. Thank you. Thank you for that, Alice. So yes, let's move on.
Sorry, Loretta, we do have one question in the text, in the chat. It says, what constitutes a literary text? That's a great question. What do you think, Alice?
Fiction.
Fiction.
Fiction. Yeah, well, you have, that world that authors create, that you get into. They created with the use of their imagination, but it's mostly fiction, but also it can be autobiography. So it can be by memoirs, can constitute literary text. And I think in the case of memoirs, they can be ways of learning history through somebody's perspective, some history lived by somebody. So that is anything that is not academic text constitutes. Oh, of course, and poetry. Yeah.
Definitely. All right, we have some more people speaking up in the chat. I'm sorry I didn't give everyone enough time. But someone said, perhaps the student needs to study English literature, and this becomes a tool for advancing their language skills. Very well said. Someone else says that it helps them to build confidence. That's an excellent point. And we have one more question that we'll take before we move on, Loretta. The question is, pedagogically speaking, which purpose do you think is the most important and practical in TESL? Can you be more specific, Mustafa? Like, what do you mean? Is this related to literature? Yes. Okay, so I guess I'll rephrase it. Like, pedagogically speaking, how do you think literature is like what is the most practical way to implement literature when teaching TESL, in your opinion?
Well, I think it depends very much on, so these are my two rules that I think are very important. Know your students, their background, their level, and their needs. And then choose the literary text that you want to use with care to address those particular students. So that's very important. And I think pedagogically, it depends on the level of the students, of course, but also we should start with fragments of a literary text, not put the whole book in front of the student and say, read it and let's learn the language. No, you take excerpts from the texts and you, of course, cater to your students, and then you go deep into analyzing, like dissecting that text, which might arise, the taste for reading the whole book. And also there's the option of the graded readers, which can work, in my opinion, mostly for lower level students.
Great, thank you so much, Alice. I think I'll hand it back to Loretta.
Okay. Thank you for the great questions and answers. Good. And now we move on to the other question for tonight. Which specific language aspects are best taught through literary sample texts? So what are those aspects that could be specifically taught through literature?
So, well, from my personal experience and my pedagogical experience, you can teach morphology, you can teach how to use articles, how to use nouns, adjectives, pronouns. You can teach syntax, sentence structure. Even if you choose texts that have a host of run-on sentences, you can teach them that works only when you are a writer in literary text, but what is wrong with that sentence grammatically speaking, so you can separate it and work with that. You can teach, of course, semantics, but lexis can be improved, vocabulary can be improved very well like that. You can teach mechanics, punctuation, and I think poetry is a great option to teach the role of punctuation. And of course, the verbs, tenses, modals, how to manipulate modal verbs in order to express wishes and possibility and all those things. Subjunctive, passive voice, reported speech, ellipsis, the role of ellipsis, for example, how to emphasize, how to paraphrase, how to say the same thing in very many different ways. So you can manipulate with the literary text the subtleties of language that perhaps you cannot find in everyday language. And yes, that will be a challenge for lower level ESL students. And that is why we go back to rule number 1, know your students and their needs. So you know which particular texts and which particular fragments from the text to choose for them. And of course, let's not forget about the paralanguage that can be learned, especially not with the written text, but with audiobooks. They learn about stress, intonation, rhythm, all those things, and also about the varieties of English, vocabulary-wise, grammar-wise, pronunciation-wise, and spelling, of course.
Thank you, Alice. That was a bunch of stuff that's all really important. Someone in the chat agrees with you. They say, knowing your students is the key. And I think that's a really powerful thing to say. So again, a gentle reminder, if you'd like to speak out loud, you can raise your hand. To do that, at the bottom of your screen, locate the reactions button and click the raise hand. Or you can also write your comment or question in the chat box. I'll read it out loud to Alice. I think this is a great question, though. I really liked what you said, Alice, about the paralinguistic things, right? Like, I love audiobooks and the difference it can make versus when you read it in your head versus when it's read to you. And through our students, what effect does that have on them, especially as a language learner? I think for some, it's awesome. And for some, maybe it's not their cup of tea, and that's still okay. So it's really cool. Okay, I don't see more comments in the chat, but I don't want to move on just yet because last time when I moved on, it was a little bit too fast. Maybe I'll invite Loretta. Do you want to maybe give your 2 cents about this question?
Of course. I always say that it's not the book that teaches your students, but it's just how you use the book, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's how you make use of the literary text that matters, and knowing your students is definitely the number 1 rule there. So I love that idea. But then at the end of the day, we also need to cater to our students' needs. And we might have students that have read so much in their L1. And why not give them the opportunity to do that in L2? And there are so many resources they can use now. So it's a great tool for sure. But making them become familiar with the text, that's one of the most important language aspects, I think. They become familiar with grammatical structure of the sentences, how sentences are combined, paragraphs are organized, ideas are represented, dialogues are represented, right? Mm-hmm. We teach them how to interview. We could get an interview, we could get a dialect from a literary text. So there are so many uses for sure, and it's a never-ending usage.
Definitely. There's a couple more comments I want to bring up from the chat. One of them was to the previous question, but I think it's also relevant here. And it says literature can help learners to develop their understanding of other cultures. And that is definitely something that we can do with text.
Absolutely. And sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead, Alice.
Literature doesn't just teach literature and language. It teaches culture, history, a lot of things, right? Imagination, how to use your imagination too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have a question in the chat. It says, what kind of exercises would you recommend in the practice stage of teaching if you want to teach sentence structures from a literary text? It's kind of a mouthful, but it's a great question.
What I have used in the past, I would use a sample text from a literary piece, and then I would follow up with an exercise a paraphrasing exercise, where I would choose a sentence from the original, and I would ask them to paraphrase that sentence, giving them the beginning 2 words, and then the rest of them they had to come up with their own idea. And then in some cases I would use a run-on sentence, and I would ask them to divide it into shorter sentences, just by going by the rule 1 sentence, 1 complete thought.
Yeah,
that would be an example.
Thank you. Oh, Gunnar, please, yep, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to share that when I was teaching a while back, I was using Common Lead. I will also share the link in the chat box in here. It's a great resource, and my students loved it. I used a lot of biographies from around the world, and not just they learned something new, but it was all from different cultures, like outstanding person, extraordinary person, and a little bit from Africa, a little from Asia or America. So it was a group project. So every group picked one biography that I choose from that specific website, give them a lot of option, whatever they are interested, and turn into a great project and a presentation. It was great. They really enjoyed it. End of the class, they said, oh my God, I ended up learning a lot of great information about this and general knowledge as well, right? So they are learning ESL. It's not just English, but it's also a bonus opportunity for the learners, I guess.
Can I say something? Thank you, Gonul. Yes, that's what I was doing as well with my students. They also learn about their own culture when they find the connections between the text that they just read and their own, right? So that's something that makes everything relevant to them.
Yes, to go what you are saying right now, I specifically, since I knew my students quite well, so I picked biographies according to their countries, and also few extra, if they already know what's happening in their culture or the country, they might able to choose somewhere else. So that was, giving an option is always very helpful, especially in literature, because you have to find a magic middle, what they gonna enjoy.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. All right, one more comment from the chat was, I think writing a paragraph can be a good thing to teach. And I think it was Loretta, I think also Alice brought this up too, right? That you can study these paragraphs from the literature and we can actually demonstrate the good and maybe some not so good parts, but why it works with literature and that kind of thing. So that's a really great point. I think that's a good place for us to move on, Loretta.
Sure. Great ideas. And Gonul, I use Common Lit a lot and I advise it. So it's a great tool. Okay, so let's move on to our next question. What is the role of audiobooks? And Colleen mentioned audiobooks a bit earlier on. So what is the role of audiobooks in developing listening skills? Alice?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question. I think that audiobooks they can help with understanding, we're going back to paralanguage, tone, pitch, accent, how you modify meaning using those, how you can manipulate your meaning using those tools. You don't have, of course, the gestures and facial expressions there, but the paralanguage is the one that helps. And how you develop the listening skills, I think a very good way to do so is when listening to audiobooks, some of them read by the authors themselves, some of them role played, depending on the book that you're reading. And I find also that it is very useful for the students when they're listening to the book, if possible, to also have the text in front of them so they can make the connection between what they hear and the word. That helps a lot with learning how to spell words correctly. So that's, I think, the main. And also using audiobooks instead of just text helps different learners, the people who learn better by listening, by hearing, and people who have different learning needs, especially when we talk about a language that is very different from their first language, when they have to hear certain sounds like the, in the English language that they may not have in their own language, so they can't recognize it, but listening to the text, to the words, and then in the story within a context, because literature is contextual, yes, that might help with the learning of the language, like I said before, in a more natural way.
Thank you, Alice. All right, so everyone, we've heard Alice's response to this question. I'd love to hear everyone else's, and don't worry if you're not somebody who wants to speak out loud, you always have the option of also putting your comments or questions in the chat. So please feel free to engage with us. We're more than happy to hear from your point of view, what your experiences are, what questions you may have, maybe even something that you've seen or heard others do and not quite sure about. We'd love to hear all of that. All right, so in the chat, we have somebody who said audiobooks provide students with accurate word pronunciations. That's a really great point. Thank you, Gunnel. Loretta says that Common Lit, the app that Gunnel had shared earlier, has an audio version as well. So that's really great to know. I'm really happy about that. Something really small I want to add in about listening. I am the kind of person where if I read a paragraph, I won't know what the heck I read, but if I hear it, it has so much more meaning for me. And so maybe some of our students are this way too, who knows? So again, I want to remind you, if you want to respond to this question, you can raise your hand. To do that, at the bottom of your screen, you want to click on the reactions button and click on raise hand, or you can type your question or your comment in the chat box. All right. Oh, Alice also mentions natural pronunciation versus computerized pronunciation. That's also a really great point. Oh, okay, so Gordon has a comment in the chat. Gordon says, when I have tried to teach using literature, I discover how many idiomatic expressions we use and that I have to explain it. That's a really great point. Idiomatic expressions and audiobooks a little bit go hand in hand. It also opens us up to talking about literary expressions and where the writer from that book originates and maybe where those expressions originate, because some expressions that we have, for example, in Canada are not the same as what are in the United States or in Britain or in Australia. And it's a really great, healthy conversation about global Englishes. It's a great way to take your classes. All right, Gunnel says, listening to audiobooks is not restricted to time and space. They can do it whenever they like. That's a really great point, especially with the environment we're in right now. Flexibility is a really, really great point. So thank you for raising that. All right, well, thank you all so much for participating in this question. I think I'll hand it back to Loretta now.
Thank you, Colleen. And we're done with our introductory questions. So I guess now we have lots of information about, at least we shared, right, and learned a lot about literary text and language teaching and learning. Now we'll move on to discussion questions. So the first one is, how can speaking be taught as a skill through literary text? Alice?
So I think there are several activities that can be designed in order to teach specific speaking using literary text. And one of them is role play. Of course, that's the most common one. And I have done that using Shakespeare. And Shakespeare is forbidding, Shakespeare's language is forbidding for English speakers, let alone ESL students. But there are ways to get them into it and to enjoy it, right? So role play, and then, you know, take a play or a dialogue in the book, assign role play, and they will do that. With Shakespeare, usually I use the original text and the modern English, and then based on the modern and original text, but mostly on the modern text for ESL students, they create their own paraphrase of the story, and then they role play it, they act it. And so that way they can show that they understood the gist of the whole scene or part that they're doing. And they get into it usually, they like it. Then you can do, of course, presentations. They can present a monologue as a speech to audience or short TED-like recording if classes happen in this environment. Then there are activities that can be done that focus on punctuation and pause. These are doable both in the face-to-face environment and online. For example, you take a fragment from a book and then you delete all the punctuation and then get them to put the punctuation and then show them the original. And it's fun because some get it right, some get the complete different meaning that might be amazing. Or ask students to fill in punctuation and pause and then discuss the results. So there are several activities and they can speak. So sometimes we think that punctuation is very important in writing, but it's not like that. Punctuation actually dictates how we speak. And the way we use punctuation in speech is important because it helps create the clear message as intended, right, and doesn't interfere with the intention of the message, the original message.
Thanks so much, Alice. I really appreciate that. So we have a couple of really great comments already in the chat. One person said they can also present a summary of a chapter. That's a really great idea. It's quite simple, and it can also help them to verify their learning to see if they understood what they read, which is really cool. Someone else said they love the idea of pronunciation. I also really appreciate that activity of taking away all different punctuation and having them added in and acted out. That's it really sells home the point of punctuation, especially in the English language. So we have another question here, and they want to know if you can recommend a book and what technical aspects that literary passage can help them teach in a classroom. So for example, is there a book that has like a very famous paragraph or phrase that you think would be really helpful for ESL learners? I guess it could be of any level.
I love Richard Wagamese's text because it's simple. It has short sentences, clear, and he has this gift of storytelling, and by using simple, common sense words and he creates amazing meaning. So of Wagamese's two books that I love, one of them I have with me here. And I just, if I have time, I just want to read a quote from it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Gave me this. So this is Richard Wagamese's One Story, One Song. It's a memoir. It's part of his autobiography. So this is the one that I like the most. And this one, I like to use this fragment because it appeals not only to teaching grammar, the sentence structure, but also the students can relate to the text because it talks about how your identity is influenced by the loss of the first language. So in other words, when you lose a language, you lose part of your identity. But also when you gain another language, you gain some other second identity, you know, the other one. So he says here, when your language disappears, so does your ability to greet the world in a traditional manner. When you lose your original language, your identity is altered. You feel clumsy walking around in your own skin. Reclaiming your language is like coming home. You don't need cuss words to express that. So this is just a piece, but all his book is, this one particularly, is based on very short sentences. Like I said, very clear, very, very simple words. He goes to this idea of using language to speak your truth and to make sure that you maintain your identity and who you are. The other book that Wagamese that I used from Wagamese is Indian Horse, and it's a nice story because it's useful for teenage learners. They can relate to that. It also teaches them about the tragedy of the genocide of the residential. I don't want to call them schools because they weren't schools. The residential places where these things happened. So this is just one author. I have actually a list of books that I have recommended that I will share with you.
Thanks so much for that, Alice. So both of the books that Alice just mentioned, I put links to them in the chat to the goodreads.com website where you can find more information about it, read a summary, etc. Really appreciate that. So Mustafa has another question. Oh, sorry, before I move on, there was two parts to the question I asked earlier. So I asked you the first part, Alice, and the second part is just how can we encourage students not to be so hard on themselves or not to stress so much about what exactly is a verb or a noun, but to focus more on learning a new language and to enjoy the journey of learning through reading. How do you think we can kind of incorporate that into literary texts and using them as tools? Oh, you're on mute, Alice, sorry.
This part of the question reminds me of when one of the writers of the books that I was teaching came and talked to my students, and I'm talking about Wei Sin Choi, and he said, when you read a book, don't focus on so much on how many metaphors and how the image was created. Yeah, when you have to do that for class, it's important, but just so you know, it's important to look at the whole picture, to try to get the main idea and to look at and to understand the words and the way they come together as the colors in a painting. putting them together creates that whole image. It's almost like a book for him, as he was describing it, is like an impressionist painting with each point of color creating the whole overall image. And so, yes, of course, it's important to be aware of the grammar and what a verb does, but you have to go beyond that and see the context in which the particular verb or noun or adjective can help create images. I always tell my students that the power of words, of grammar, and everything that is language is to make thought visible. That's what their purpose has to be, to give the reader the image okay. Have I
That
been
was
talking
my
for a
fault.
while?
That was my fault. I'm sorry. I muted you by accident.
Where did you lose me?
We only lost you for 2 seconds. So
Okay.
start back
Well,
where
you got that part with make thought visible with
Yes.
words. Okay.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much, Alice. We really appreciate that. We have one more question in the chat, and it says, we can also improve learners' critical thinking by asking what they would do if they were in the place of one specific character. And this can really help learners practice conditional sentences type 2 and 3. That's really cool to have them take a situation that a character was in and maybe present it out loud to the class. That's a really great idea. And it's a really nice way to, again, incorporate speaking in literature.
That reminds me of an activity that I did with my students when we were teaching Othello. So we were if clause. I was teaching Othello and if clause with Iago. If Iago lived in the 21st century, what would his Facebook page look like?
That is cool. I love that. It's also digital literacy too, right? Because they're probably going to be using, social media. That's very cool. One more question, and then we'll move on, Loretta. Ume says, do you think collocation is a good idea to teach from literature?
Absolutely. There are a lot of things that you can use in literature, and especially when you look at text, when you choose a text that has dialogue and you have, of course, characters interacting with each other. The main purpose of a writer is to make the characters credible. And how do they do that? Not only by describing their actions, but also by their words. So collocation, idiomatic expressions, they are in the words of the characters. That's how you learn contextually how they're used in interaction that you don't have to be part of in everyday language. You just listen and observe, like read in this case.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks so much, Alice. Loretta, I think we'll move on now.
Yes, and we're ready. So, written language. What are some benefits of using literary text to improve thought articulation and to make thought visible, that you just mentioned, with written language?
Thank you for the question. So because, as I was saying, because literary text is crafted to be credible and to help the reader visualize places and in events and worlds, it will offer an exemplary way of articulating thought with clarity. So it's the best way in which you can make your thoughts clear to whoever is your receiver, your reader in this case. That is not to say that learners will write like the authors they study, but literary text can be a model for good, effective writing. Again, I'm coming back to Wei-Sun Choi's advice when he was talking to my students. He was telling them that this is, well, you can aim to write like me, but you may not get there. At least you know that you tried and you learned a few tricks of the trade by looking at the way I write and looking at the way I organize my words on the page. I think I misquoted him in some places, but that was the idea. So of course, and I go back to that idea, a big role in this is taken by the selection of the literary text that the teacher makes to cater to the level of the students, to whatever the students will find relevant as literary text.
Thanks so much, Alice. For everyone, in case you want to learn more about waste and joy, I just put a little link to the Canadian Encyclopedia that has a lot of info about him. So thanks so much for bringing him up, Alice. And again, we'd love to invite you to, give your response to this question or to ask some further questions to Alice. So a gentle reminder that you can raise your hand to ask your question or to say your comment out loud, or you can also type your response or your question into the chat as well. I think someone had mentioned earlier in the chat something about critical thinking. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think it's a little bit relevant here, right? We can use situations from literary texts to encourage our students to engage in critical thinking. And I think that can be really useful.
I'd also add that our students learn best when they have a sample in front of them. So maybe even using essays, literary essays, and bring them over and see how it can be done in literature and compare and contrast. I think that's really valid, and it helps our students a lot.
Yeah, totally. Maybe Alice, could you give an example of, what kind of things you've done to make writing more visual through literary text? That might be a good idea to encourage some thoughts.
Like I said, I used, sometimes I used literary text from books that were put into movies. So what we did when I used to teach writer's craft, we used to compare the visualization of the text with the original story, because sometimes, of course, in the script for a movie is completely changed. So that's one way. And then another way I used when also in writer's craft, I would my students would write a one-act play. They would create a one-act play, and they would work with the drama class to put that play on stage. So they would their written piece took form in a live acting way on stage. So they could kind of like see how their story was interpreted, because it ended up being interpreted by their classmates. I don't know if I answered that question.
No, you did. I love that.
Okay.
It reminded me of an example when I was in high school and I was taking French class. We read Phantom of the Opera in French, and we also watched the movie in English. And it was really interesting because it was almost like it was a plurilingual assignment where we got to explore the differences in how it was visually and explained and also done in English versus the book. And there were several actually really important changes that occurred, and our instructor was trying to walk us through perhaps why this happened. Is there a benefit to perhaps English speakers that French speakers this would not have worked with? So it was a really interesting thing. And sometimes when what you read and what you see doesn't line up, it makes you feel almost like you're betrayed as the reader. I think we've all been through that when we say, hey, that's not how you looked in my head. I don't like this.
I did that with my students with Lawrence Hill's Book of Negroes. Because it was turned into a series on CBC. So we watched one episode and we matched it with, or not so much matched it with the part from the book that was adapted.
Yes. I'm just going to get a link to the Book of Negroes here because it's a wonderful book that I think is impeccable. And I'm just going to share that in the chat quickly for everyone. Okay, so from the chat, we have a couple of comments. One person said, reading will improve writing skills in many ways. And I think we can all attest to that, whether it's vocabulary, it's seeing different kinds of sentences that exist and how to use them, or even just being exposed to language and coming to love it. I think that's a really great point. We have another comment here. It talks about critical race theory, so very exciting. So it says, as racism is one popular topic in the 21st century, do you think it's a good idea to pick literature that can be analyzed through critical race theory to encourage anti-racism in a multicultural ESL environment, or no? That's a great question. Thanks so much, Mustafa.
My answer is yes. Of course, you have to choose your text carefully. And when you do, you have to make sure that you are clear on how you're going to explain. If it's a hard text to explain, I'm thinking To Kill a Mockingbird right? Which was forbidden and everything. But if you choose to do that, I used to teach To Kill a Mockingbird a long time ago when it wasn't, and though there were fragments from there that I had to focus on and explain to the students why certain words are not to be said, why the impact of it. So it turned into a lesson on culture, racism, and so which, you know, I started using the text. So yes, I would say it's a very good way to do that.
I agree with you, Alice. And I think when we also consider some of our students come from monocultures where they're not exposed to this, and their ideas around race or culture are quite different. So it's kind of nice to give them a safe space to discuss these issues before they experience it or go about it in the real world. So I love that example you gave, Alice. We have another question from Portia. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a statement from Portia. It's actually an activity that looks really fun. So Portia says, getting learners to predict the end of the story using their creativity and imagination, and then asking them to write a short paragraph can be a fun activity. And I totally agree with that, Portia. Thanks you so much. All right, then. Thanks, everyone. I think we can go on to our next question.
Okay. So our next question focuses on reading skills. And the question is, what reading skills and strategies are we aiming to teach with the use of literary text? We touched a bit on this, but if there's anything else, Alice.
I can be a little bit more specific on this. So, of course, when reading, you can't write well if you don't read a lot. And reading is one of the most important things. And you have to understand, we teach students to read in different ways for different purposes. We teach them to read intensively for a specific purpose. We teach them to read extensively for entertainment. So we teach them to skim for main idea, for summarizing, for critical thinking so that they can respond to text, to build an argument, to gather information, to just explain things. We teach them to scan the text, to look for specific information so that they can answer questions, direct specific questions. Then there's also, that's important, silent reading, where we teach them, at least I do, and I know a lot of us do not pronounce each word for yourself. This is something the ESL students tend to do, that focus on the word rather than what the words together do. And then there comes the question, I know all the words in the text, but I don't understand what the text means, what they do together, right? So we teach them to understand reading for general idea, so that they do not perceive the text as a word-by-word structure, and to find the meaning through context, sometimes to guess the words from the context. Something also that ESL students tend to do, they look for every word they don't know, they look it up in the dictionary. So I tell them, don't do that because you'll never finish reading it. You have to try to guess, use prefixes, suffixes. I do a lesson on that before, how to guess the meanings of certain words within context. And of course, making predictions, asking questions, it's important to develop critical thinking, paraphrasing again. And when I do reading activities, I always have these stages that we all know: pre-reading, predicting, which is very important. I show them a picture. So I visualize the text by showing them a picture that is not connected, or there is a connection with the text, but it's not from the story. So they can guess what the text might be about and how it's connected with the picture. Then while reading activities, and then after reading activities and creative writing assignments like the ones that were mentioned, I always do that. Or, you know, I ask the students to imagine that they are a character and then tell the story from the perspective of that character, which we perhaps in the original don't hear, the voice we don't hear.
Thanks for that, Alice. So Alice, you mentioned reading intensively versus reading extensively, and it reminded me of an excellent webinar that TESL Ontario put on by our very own Gunnel, who is here right now. I put the link to it in the chat. It's a webinar about extensive reading. So if you want to hear more about that topic, Gunnel is really great. It was a wonderful webinar, and you're bound to hear and learn some great activities from that. So that's in the chat right now. But someone else said, and this is a really great point, Ume says, for me, telling them the purpose of their reading is really important. And I think that's a great point. Like, why are you even doing this reading? What is the benefit to you as a language learner? But what is also the benefit to you as an adult in whatever the context that you are is? Because I think it's multifaceted too. All right, Mustafa says, one reading strategy we can teach is that reading is an interactive skill. Students can be encouraged to discuss the theme at home, within their school, within their community. I love that idea of interaction, Mustafa. That's very cool. All right.
One more thing, can I say? Speaking of interactive reading, there are a lot of writers, a lot of texts that allow for that, because what the authors do, they invite you as a reader into the story. They leave those, open-ended parts that they invite you to participate indirectly.
And that's a very cool idea. Yeah, Ume, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one with Mustafa's point. Like, as he said, that is an interactive activity reading. What I do, and I ask my student to do, like, take a pen while reading and just underline and write their comments, write their comments side by side. Oh, I don't agree. Oh, maybe emoji kind of thing, like thinking. Oh, I don't know. So, or different kind of color coding, red pen, green pen, or highlighting. So like if you see my, books, those are really, really dirty because I just underline them. But afterwards, like maybe when I prepare for my exam, then it helps a lot. So I also tell my students to do that. So this is how, like, book is something like, it doesn't have any life, but that's how we can make it like, a lively, a partner that I'm communicating with. Yeah.
Ume, have you ever had an argument with your book before? Because I know I have.
Yeah. I love to, underline the books. Yeah.
Like we mentioned, right, it's a great way to actually engage and invite your students or invite the learners to become a part of the environment or in part of the interaction. It's a great experience, and it can really turn reading from being something that you dread to something that you enjoy, to even a resource, to something that can help you with a career, your personal life, anything. It becomes whatever you make it when you make it interactive.
Yeah. And, we try to keep the books, like, after 5 years or 10 years, I have books like 20 years old, and I just browse sometimes shelf and I leaf through and say, oh my God, I wrote it 10 years back. So that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
And even like activities like challenging your learners at the beginning of this book, what did you think? And then at the end of this book, what did you think?
Exactly.
Did your thinking change on this topic, and why or why not? Because I know for myself, I can think of books where I started reading it and I had a certain point of view, and by the end I was upside down. I was shifted, right?
Yeah.
Totally. Thank you so much, Ume.
Welcome.
All right, so in the chat there's a lot of really nice comments, just thanking Ume or thanking Alice for their wonderful contributions. And ultimately we're saying reading is active. And it's great to read your own comments from many years ago. So I really appreciate that. I think we can move on now, Loretta.
Sure. I just wanted to add something about the title of a written sample. So I remember an activity I've done with my students that I gave them the same literary text, but one group had the title of that text, but the others didn't, and their interpretations were so different. So there's so much we can do, and critical thinking is definitely one of them, but also engaging actively with the text but just the lack of the title changes everything, right? So very lovely discussions. Great. So let's move on to our next topic. We'll move on to integration between L1 and L2. So how can we integrate the first language in the learning of a second language mediated by literary texts? We talk about translations, but what's missing between these two texts, and how are ideas encoded and decoded differently in the two languages? Colleen talked a bit about a movie and a book, like in English and French, but I'm sure, Alice, you have a lot more to share as well.
Yes, and unfortunately in some ESL classes, because of what is prescribed by the ministry and by the powers that be, the first language is a no-no. So students are not allowed to use it, which I think is a big mistake. Because it's important, like I said before, and I agree in what Amise did, when you completely lose a language, you lose part of your identity, and that makes you hate the second language, and that's not the point of learning the second language, right? So I think it's important to encourage the students to demonstrate learning by asking them to provide literary text from their first language and compare them with the English translated version, for example, and then to see, can you see me, hear me?
Yeah, you're good, Alice.
So to compare them, to compare their original, because a lot of, let's say, Shakespeare, you could take Shakespeare, it was translated in several languages. It might have been translated in their language. So what is their first language translation? How is it different or similar? What's lost in the story from the plot in the translation? So they can identify that. And they can look at how ideas are presented, articulated with in different ways, with different patterns and idioms in their language versus the second language, and how does that affect the storyline and the character development. Also, it's important to give students the opportunity to offer their own translation or version, and then assign paragraph reflection writing or oral reflection on that. What did they learn? Which one did they find more challenging to read? Of course, it will be the second language, but it depends on their level. Sometimes it depends on that. And I think it's very important to integrate the first language into the learning of the second language with text, with literary text, no matter how different these two languages are. Because sometimes some patterns of the language are not recognizable, of the first language are not recognizable in the second language, so the students cannot make the analogy. So they need to understand, for example, in Russian, there is no article. They don't know what to do with the articles, no matter how much grammar they learn, unless they find an analogy, something that relates to their language. So a literary text might help there. And also they can learn both from similarities and differences in the first and second languages. And again, it comes back to that makes it important what type of literary text we choose when we allow and encourage the use of the first language.
Thanks so much, Alice. All right, there's a lot of really great comments, so I want to jump right into it. But I want to remind everyone that if you'd like to answer or speak out loud, you can always raise your hand. And I mean on Zoom, you click the reactions button and click raise hands so you can comment out loud. But I'll also read everything out that's in the chat as well. All right, so firstly, I think it's in reference to the previous question, but Gunnel has a really cool acronym that she uses, and it's KWL. So K is for know, W is for want to know, and L is for learned. And it's a really great way to read with purpose. You can think about the things that you know, the things that you want to know, the things that you've learned already. That's really cool. Ume really agrees with the idea of translanguaging and says that you can use your L1 to improve your L2 learning, which is really great. But just like as Alice has said, sometimes there are language policies that are actually barriers to implementing different ways of learning. Barbara has a really great question for you, Alice. Barbara wants to know if you've ever used graphic novels.
Yes. Yes, Shakespeare. When I taught Macbeth, I had a really low group of ESL students, and I was supposed to teach them Macbeth, the bloody tragedy. So we used a graphic novel with the text. So they could, and when we used the graphic text, the graphic novel, they added, the students, like one of the people here, Ume, I think was talking about adding their own comments and their own thought bubbles. That's exactly what happened. So their graphic novels were with pictures and personalized, very personalized. Yeah.
And that's very good. Thank you. All right, so something else is, it's quite an interesting question from Mustafa, and it's kind of a question about immersion. So Mustafa says, I think if students are in immersion, then the L1 should not be used. But in ESL, prohibition of the L1 sounds kind of colonial to me. What do you think about this? And I think it's kind of like, you know, like the French immersion system we have here and that kind of thing.
Well, we've seen how the French immersion system works. I'm sorry, but I mean, too few Canadians for me speak French fluently. I would have to disagree with that. Even if it's immersion, you're immersing in the language. You still need to make, in order for you to empower yourself to use that second language, you have to have that analogy with your first language. Otherwise, you will be losing some of the mechanisms that create patterns and structures, and you will not understand really. My example before, like if you are trying to teach somebody about some structures that don't exist at all in their first language, it's like throwing them in the water and telling them swim, but what if they don't have any skills and then they drown? So it's kind of risque, I think. And I think it's important to make reference to the first language, not the same as you would do in a regular ESL class, but I think there should not be this complete lack of use of the first language reference.
Yeah. Thank you, Alice. As somebody who, yeah, sorry, Ume, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm speaking a lot. I'm sorry for that.
No, don't be sorry.
I have something to share from my own experience, like regarding the L1 and L2, because sometime like 2 years back, maybe I was working in a private school where most of my students were Chinese, and they came from China like at the grade 9, grade 8, grade 7, and without any like much background about English. So when they arrived, my work was to like make familiar with the everyday language use and introducing to them the English literature, lower level, beginner level. So I used to, translate all the languages in English into Chinese. So Chinese and English dictionary, we like every day we followed in the class. But the problem started when I gave them to do some reading activity, like reading comprehension. They had a kind of mobile app. So they scan that that paragraph and they translate that into Chinese. And actually, they don't read it in English. They read the whole paragraph in Chinese. And then I started. So I talked to the principal and I said, I think this is not the right way of doing, because they are comprehending in Chinese. So they are not comprehending. They are not using their cognitive skill in English language. So like there should be a level when to stop it. Like I think it's from my own experience, it is like when they're in the beginning level, we can use for understanding, we can use the L1. But when they're like on the go, they need to improve that language. I think then we should restrict the use of language. So I'd really love to know from, expert opinions from you. What do you think?
I agree with you, Ume. I mean, yeah. I mean, yes, there's a difference here between allowing students to translate completely and explaining to them that in order to be reaching that level where you think in the second language, you can switch from first and second language. You need to gradually reduce the dependency on the first language. But at the back of your mind, you always have to be having the tools to make analogies in grammar specifically, between the first and second language. Sometimes they can find analogies in idioms. We say the same things and mean the same things in different languages. And if they can find that analogy in their first language, then they understand easier what we mean in the second language, right?
Yeah. But we also as a teacher have to know like where to stop. Like if we allow them to do that, maybe they won't be able to, reach to the expected level that we want them to.
I did teach like you did in a private school where the majority of students were Chinese, and it was a policy they were not allowed to use Google translators. They were not allowed to use those highlighters that actually translate. They were not allowed to do that in class. What they did at home, that was their problem. And we only allowed them to use English only dictionaries in class. So we taught them, because they didn't know how to use the dictionaries. They did not know how to find the words in the dictionary. So gradually, there were some rules that they had to follow, and gradually they got used to it, and they started. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think many of us, especially in the Canadian context, if you teach EAP, or perhaps if you teach Link in a certain cultural area, or if you work in a private school, many of us are faced with this L1 versus L2. And when you have students who are at a level of proficiency where you can't reach them, there has to be some sort of mediation, or else the efforts are going to be wasted, unfortunately, right? Thank you for that. One more question, then we're going to go into our breakout rooms. It's from Farhana, and Farhana says, I teach my Link learners Christmas literature at Christmas time. Is this a form of Canadian culture that I teach my students? What do we think about that?
Yes, it is, but it's not just Canadian. Not only Canadians celebrate Christmas. So it's and that's a good thing, because you can say, look, in Canada, this is how we celebrate Christmas. But also, what is an equivalent of this celebration in your culture? So they can make a connection with that. Other countries celebrate Christmas, but in very many different ways. The different types of meats that we prepare, the different types of foods, because food is always something that people can relate to in terms of culture, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thanks, Alice. I appreciate it. And last comment, I just want to read it because it's a great comment from Portia. It says, create a reading club to encourage students to read different genres. Then they can have group discussions on the different kinds of books that they read. Students can also compare how they feel about those books, and it creates great discussions and interactions. And the focus is on fluency, which is really great. So thanks so much for that, Portia. Gunnar raises a good point. Some people in Canada who are Canadians don't celebrate Christmas. So I think kind of like what Alice is saying, we can use that time to say that it is a statutory holiday, but there are some people here who don't celebrate it because maybe they celebrate other things or they don't celebrate at all. And all of these experiences are Canadian. I think it's a great point. Thank you, Gunnar. All right, I think I'll hand it back to Loretta now.
Great. And as Colleen announced, we're going to go into our breakout room activity. So we have a question for you. Colleen will divide you into breakout rooms. And the question you might want to discuss with one another is this one. So reading literary texts requires extensive use of imagination. We talked about imagination throughout our discussion tonight. So the question is, what is the role of imagination in teaching language through literature? How can the teacher stimulate the student's imagination? I hope you'll enjoy your time and discuss with each other on this question. Colleen?
Yep, this is one of my favorite questions that we have today. So we're going to put you in your groups. You're going to have 10 minutes. So please don't hog the time. Let your fellow roommates talk as well. And we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Remember that you have to click join to go into your breakout room. If you don't click join, you won't be put in there. All right, that's awesome. Thanks for joining us. Was it fun? I see some excited faces.
Yeah, it was fun, but it was too short. I wanted to stay a little longer.
I know. It's one of the downfalls. I wish I could let you guys stay in there all the time. All right, but I figured since we have you back, it might be fun if we invite each group to just tell us a little bit about what they had time to chat about while they were in the breakout rooms. So I'll start with group one, which was Angela, Barbara, Delia, and Ume. If you want to tell us a little bit about what you talked about in your groups. And if you want to type it in the chat box, that's okay too, or you can unmute yourself and say it out loud. Either or works for us.
Well, I can just, I learned something from Ume about, she tackled great expectations in the class, like in Pakistan 15 years ago. And so she had students read out loud and someone else was illustrating what they imagined to be the story. So I thought that was, a fantastic idea. And hopefully something I can use in future class.
Yeah, That sounds cool. Thank you, Angela. Would anyone else from room one like to share?
Yeah, I
And
also learned
Angela,
from.
oh, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, I
Maybe-
learned
maybe
from
we'll-
Barbara.
Oh.
I learned from Barbara, like she's using a bilingual book, like
Mhm.
one side English and one side Czech language. And so this is amazing idea. I can't think of. Yeah, this is really wow idea. I first time heard about this time. I have seen like old English, new English, but side by side, like translating a book and using that for teaching, like this is wow.
It makes for a lot of arguments as to proper translation. But Angela had a beautiful, for quintessential Canadian, the hockey sweater, the book, the audio, and the NFB short. That's priceless. I mean, that is Canada for many, right?
Yes, definitely. All right, thank you so much, room one. Let's go on to room two, which was Faith, Farhana, and Gunal.
Okay, I'm not too sure who would like to talk because we didn't get a chance to choose a reporter.
Oh, that's okay.
I'm not too sure if Faith would like to share hers and Farhana can share hers and I'll share mine, or I'll just report all of it. I don't know. I just don't really want to take over. I just want to know.
Sure, you can report all of it. It's okay. Faith, I'm okay with that.
Okay. I'll quickly mention, I might miss some stuff, but the most important that we talked about is that Farhana suggested that she uses literature a lot.
Yes.
So she suggests that she uses a lot of questions to answer, and that way they will kind of immerse themselves with the literature, have a better understanding by answering the questions. And Faith and I, we kind of talked about graphic novels that she thought will be great for imagination. And so basically how it works is you look at the pictures, but avoid the written text, and then cover the written text and just look at the image and perhaps try to remember the story. That will be perfect for the beginner levels, like a lower level students. We thought that will be very nice. And also using the content words to create images in students' mind so they can tell us the story, whatever they may remember. Also giving a lot of options to students about what they would like to read. Perhaps if we have 5 or 6 options so that students are interested. And Faith was saying something about one of her students, how she was from a different country, but she had to go to Saudi Arabia as a nurse, and husband would like to know a little bit more about Saudi Arabia.
Nice. There's lots of different ways you can use imagination there. So thanks so much, room two. Now we'll go on to room three, which was Gordon and Shy Rose. Oh, just 2 people there. I'm sorry about that, but I hope it was still fun.
Okay. Well, I think Gordon really shared a good example for bringing out imagination. Was Gordon, do you want to say it yourself?
Okay. I've been teaching to 4 or 5 link level, and I found this book of short stories called How to Pronounce Knife by Suvanakam Thamavangsa. So she's a Laotian Canadian. And so the main story of the collection is about a little girl who goes to school, and she has an argument with the teacher about how to write the word knife because she can't understand what the K is doing there. So anyway, it paints a picture of life, of recent recent immigrants that's kind of austere. And so with some of the students, I tried to talk about just the living situation, what she's describing in terms of their family rituals, and in some cases that was stimulating for the students. And in other cases, I had students who didn't want to think about those kinds of things.
Got it. Thank you, Gordon.
So it can cut both ways.
It really can. And Shiros, did you want to share anything yourself as well?
Maybe I'll still keep going with Gordon's point where he said he tried to explain the word rusty. And the student, like, he was like, I'm rusty with my whatever. And the student, rusty, to understand that for soccer, his student enjoyed soccer and hadn't played for a while. So that was, I think, relating your real life situation to where you're trying to kind of provoke and make them understand that. For me, I can't really use too much literature right now. It's very basic and abstract ideas are not well received just yet. But I do try to use picture prompts and then see where that goes, and then maybe hold out another picture. Well, what else could have happened? What else? Like, just keep going with that. What else? So it's working. It's helping. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Gordon, what you were talking about reminded me that Alice has provided us with a beautiful list of literary texts. I've just shared the link in the chat. It's a Dropbox. If you click the link, you'll be able to download that document, and it's a really great list. The book that Gordon mentioned is the first book on that list. So just to show you that, great minds think alike. And thanks so much, Alice, for providing us with that list. And thanks, Gordon, for telling us a little bit about the first book. It's a great preview. All right, thanks so much, room 3. Let's go on to room 4. So we have Linda, Mustafa, and Munisa. Hi.
Yeah, it's Mustafa.
Mustafa.
So I'm just going to start, maybe just the others are going to complete that. So I think that we can extend imagination beyond classroom and literature, like to real life. And by this, I mean, we can ask students what they would do, for example, if they were in different situation that the characters in the novel, for example, were. This way, 2 benefits for that. One is they can just practice conditional sentences. And when it comes to imagination, I think we can teach them to improve their perspective, so that we can avoid conflict in real life. That's what I said.
I love that. And that also has to do a lot with like culture, right? And
Exactly.
I mentioned this earlier, but when you come from a monoculture, it can be a shock to come here and know that people have different ways of thinking and being.
Definitely, yeah.
So what you mentioned is a great kind of way, like you said, to extend imagination into real life. Like, what would you do if you were in a situation? So thank you for that, Mustafa.
You're welcome.
Anyone else in room 4, would you like to share? All right, no worries. So I think with that, we're just about at the end of our session. So Loretta, I think I might just go on to the closing bookends if you want to just close out with the thanking Alice and that kind of thing.
I just wanted to share Alice's email address and LinkedIn account before I give the floor to Colleen and close the session for us. So thank you so much, Alice. And for everybody who would like to contact her with extra questions or comments, you could have a look at her email and LinkedIn. Thank you again, Alice.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to grab Alice's LinkedIn right now, the link. Give me 2 seconds, everybody. I promise I'm going to get it right now.
Well, in the meantime, I'm just going to thank everyone for sharing and for listening, and Loretta and Colleen for organizing. Thank you so much. That was great. That was wonderful. Thank you.
It was a pleasure, Alice.
I agree. Okay, so everyone, just a gentle reminder, there's tons of great things that are links that are in this chat. We have the link to Alice's great suggested reads. We also have the link to her LinkedIn. I just added there, but also the other books that she mentioned. I put links to good reads throughout the chat. So don't forget to go back and grab those quickly if you need them. And lastly, I'm just going to share my screen and tell you a little bit about what you can expect after this session is done. So give me 2 seconds, just grab that really quickly.